The strangest part wasn't that the homeowners association eventually showed up at my front door offering to pay for every dollar of damage they had caused. The strangest part was how nervous they looked when they did it. The president of the association stood on my porch clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles were turning white, forcing a smile that looked more painful than friendly. 2 board members stood behind her, avoiding eye contact, shifting their weight from foot to foot like kids waiting outside a principal's office. A month earlier, those same people had acted like they owned the world. Now they looked like they were walking into a hostage negotiation. What they didn't realize was that replacing 6 destroyed security cameras wasn't the thing I cared about anymore. The cameras were never the real issue. The real issue was still out there, still running, and they had absolutely no idea where it was. To explain how things got that far, I need to go back to the day I came home from a fishing trip and found out just how dangerous a little bit of power can be when it lands in the wrong hands. My name is Ethan Cole. I live just outside a town called Silver Creek, Colorado. It's one of those places where everybody waves at each other, where people still leave tools in truck beds and assume they'll still be there in the morning. At least that's how it used to be. My property sits along the edge of an upscale subdivision called Pine Hollow. Most people assume I live inside the neighborhood because my land touches theirs, but legally it's a completely different story. My house had been there long before the developers ever arrived. When they built Pine Hollow, they basically wrapped the entire subdivision around my property like water flowing around a rock in a river. Everybody inside the neighborhood belonged to the HOA. I didn't. Never had. Never would. For years, that arrangement worked just fine. I wasn't one of those guys who constantly fought with neighbors. I kept my grass cut. I fixed my fences. I helped people when storms knocked trees down. I wasn't trying to make enemies. I just liked being left alone. The only person who ever seemed bothered by that was the HOA president, a woman named Cynthia Wells. Cynthia had one of those personalities that somehow made every conversation feel like a performance review. Over the years, she sent me several letters about things she thought I should do differently. Once she complained about a shed on my property. Another time she complained about my mailbox. Every time I politely reminded her that I wasn't part of her association. Every time she smiled, nodded, and somehow managed to look annoyed anyway. Looking back now, I think that bothered her more than anything. Most people around Pine Hollow followed her rules. I didn't have to. The trouble started after a series of break-ins hit the county. One family lost thousands of dollars worth of tools. Another had an ATV stolen right out of their garage. A retired couple down the road had their truck broken into twice in 6 months. After hearing enough stories, I decided to invest in security. Nothing crazy. Just 6 high-quality cameras covering my driveway, workshop, garage, backyard, and both entrances to my property. Every camera pointed at my land. None looked into anybody else's windows. None watched neighboring yards. A county deputy actually complimented the setup once. A year later, one of those cameras captured footage that helped identify a thief stealing equipment from construction sites. That alone made the investment worthwhile. Then came the fishing trip. 4 days in the mountains with no cell service, no emails, no HOA nonsense. Just fresh air, cold water, and trout. Honestly, it was one of the best weekends I'd had in years, which is why the sight waiting for me when I got home felt so surreal. At first, I couldn't figure out what seemed wrong. You know that feeling when your brain notices something before you consciously do? I pulled into my driveway and sat there staring at the house. Then it hit me. The camera above the garage was gone. I frowned and climbed out of the truck. Maybe a storm knocked it down. Then I looked toward the workshop. Another one was missing. My stomach tightened. By the time I finished walking around the property, all 6 cameras had vanished. Every single one. The mounting brackets had been ripped off. Wires were hanging loose. Screws had been torn out. Somebody hadn't stolen them. Somebody had removed them. Deliberately. Then I found the pile. It sat beside my workshop like a trash heap. Broken camera housings, cracked lenses, bent brackets, shattered plastic. Thousands of dollars worth of equipment smashed into pieces. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring. I wasn't even angry yet. My brain was still trying to process what I was looking at. Then I noticed the bright orange paper taped beside my back door. I walked over and pulled it off the wall. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, Community Privacy Enforcement Notice. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd my mind rejected it. I started reading. According to the notice, my surveillance equipment had created discomfort among neighborhood residents and had therefore been removed in order to protect community privacy standards. Removed. Not reported. Not discussed. Not questioned. Removed. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I looked around my property, wondering if I had somehow entered an alternate universe while I was gone. Nobody from Pine Hollow had authority over my land. Not legally, not financially, not morally. Yet somebody had walked onto private property, destroyed thousands of dollars worth of equipment, and left paperwork behind, acting like they'd performed a public service. That's when the anger finally arrived. Not explosive anger. The dangerous kind. Quiet anger. The kind that settles into your chest and starts asking questions. Who authorized this? Who thought this was acceptable? And why were they so confident they could get away with it? I carried the broken notice inside, set my bags down, and immediately started making phone calls. The first number I dialed belonged to Cynthia Wells. She answered on the 3rd ring. Cynthia speaking. The moment she heard my name, there was a pause. Not surprise. Recognition. Like she'd been expecting this call. I just got home, I said. Would you like to explain why all 6 of my security cameras are smashed beside my workshop? Silence. Then a sigh. Mr. Might. Cole, we've already addressed that matter. I remember staring out my kitchen window and shaking my head. Addressed it? You addressed it by destroying my property. Her voice remained calm. Too calm. The board determined that your camera system was creating significant discomfort among our residents. Residents who don't live on my property. Residents who felt they were being monitored. They weren't being monitored. Perception matters. The second she said that, I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a script. Every answer sounded rehearsed, corporate, detached from reality. I asked who physically removed the cameras. She refused to answer. I asked who authorized entering private property. She refused to answer that too. Then she said something that genuinely stunned me. The equipment has already been disposed of, so unfortunately there's nothing further to discuss. Disposed of. As if she were talking about old furniture left at a curb. I stared at the phone in disbelief. Then I laughed. Again, not because anything was funny. Because sometimes people become so ridiculous your brain doesn't know how else to react. Cynthia, I said slowly, you understand I don't belong to your HOA. Right? Your property impacts the community. That's not what I asked. We acted in the best interests of our residents. You entered private property and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of equipment. There was a brief pause. Then she said, "Goodbye, Mr. Cole," and the line went dead. I stood there holding the phone in silence. Most people probably think that's the moment I called a lawyer. Truth is, I didn't. Not yet. Maybe I should have. But something about Cynthia's confidence bothered me. She wasn't acting like someone worried about consequences. She acted like someone who genuinely believed consequences didn't apply to her. And that realization would lead me down a path neither of us could have predicted. That night, sitting alone in my workshop surrounded by pieces of shattered equipment, I made a phone call that would change everything. The person I called that night was an old friend named Lucas Grant. We had known each other since college, back when neither of us had much money and most of our life decisions involved cheap pizza and bad ideas. Somewhere along the way, our careers went in completely different directions. I ended up in construction management. Lucas went into cybersecurity. The guy spent half his life helping corporations secure their networks, and the other half being paid to break into them so they could find weaknesses before criminals did. If there was anyone I trusted to think differently about security, it was Lucas. When he answered, I told him the entire story from beginning to end. The cameras, the destruction, the notice, Cynthia's phone call. I expected him to get angry. Instead, he started laughing. Not a little chuckle. Full-on laughter. I remember sitting there, surrounded by broken camera parts, thinking maybe I'd lost my mind. "You think this is funny?" I asked. "I absolutely do," he said. "Look at us. No, hear me out. They tore down 6 cameras because they didn't like cameras? Apparently. And that's all they objected to?" I frowned. "What do you mean? Did they object to security systems? No. Motion sensors? No. Property monitoring? No. Just cameras." I thought about it for a second. "Yeah, pretty much just cameras." The laughter stopped. Then his voice changed. "Congratulations." "For what?" "I think they just gave you an opportunity." The next afternoon, Lucas drove out to Silver Creek. We spent nearly 3 hours walking around my property while he pointed at things I'd never paid attention to before. Tiny weatherproof sensors, pressure detection pads, passive infrared devices, movement trackers no larger than a thumb. Most of them blended so naturally into the environment you'd never notice them unless someone specifically pointed them out. Some looked like fence hardware, others disappeared into landscaping. A few could be hidden inside birdhouses, utility boxes, or decorative rocks. What fascinated me wasn't the technology, it was the philosophy behind it. None of those devices recorded video. None captured faces, none stored images. They simply detected movement patterns, activity, presence, entry points, behavior, information without surveillance, at least not in the way most people imagine surveillance. Standing beside my driveway, Lucas said something that stuck with me. A camera tells you what happened. A sensor network tells you what's happening. I stared at him. Most people spend too much time gathering evidence. Smart security is about awareness, and this is legal? He looked at me like I'd asked whether sunlight was legal. You're monitoring activity on your own property, so nobody can claim privacy violations. Good luck making that argument. That conversation changed everything. For the next 10 days, we built something completely different. Every evening after work, Lucas came over. We installed hidden sensors along fence lines, movement detection around the workshop, pressure monitoring near equipment storage, entry alerts near access roads. Nothing fancy enough to belong in a spy movie, nothing illegal, just smart. By the time we finished, every important area of my property quietly communicated with a secure application on my phone. If somebody crossed a specific boundary, I received an alert. If unusual movement occurred after midnight, I received an alert. If activity happened while I was away, I received an alert. The most impressive part was how invisible everything looked. Visitors could stand 10 feet away and never notice a thing. A week later, the system started producing data. Most alerts were harmless. Deer wandering through the backlot, coyotes cutting across the tree line, delivery drivers approaching the workshop, the usual stuff. But then patterns started emerging, interesting patterns. One afternoon, I received a notification while eating lunch. Movement near the eastern fence. I checked the activity log. A landscaping crew from Pine Hollow had crossed 30 yards onto my property instead of using the proper access route. Nothing major, but technically they were trespassing. 2 days later, another alert appeared. Maintenance contractors, same area, same shortcut, then another. And another. The more data accumulated, the more obvious something became. A surprising number of people treated property lines like suggestions, not barriers, not boundaries, suggestions. The sensor network wasn't revealing criminals, it was revealing assumptions. Assumptions that my land existed for other people's convenience. A few weeks later, I attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by a couple named Tom and Rachel Monroe. Good people. They lived near the edge of Pine Hollow and had always treated me respectfully. Honestly, I almost didn't go, but Rachel made incredible brisket and Tom had a habit of collecting ridiculous stories, so conversation was never boring. About 30 minutes after arriving, I noticed something strange. Conversations kept stopping when I approached, not dramatically, just enough to notice. People glanced toward my property, a few exchanged looks. Then one of the residents wandered over carrying a paper plate. "So," he said casually, "how's the new security setup working?" I smiled. "Pretty well." "What kind of system is it?" "Just some upgrades." He nodded. "Too quickly. Must be pretty sophisticated." It does what I need." Another man joined the conversation. "I heard it can detect movement from really far away." I almost laughed. "You heard that?" His face turned red. Suddenly he became very interested in his potato salad. That was my first clue. Rumors were spreading. People knew I had replaced the cameras. What they didn't know was with what. And human imagination is an incredible thing. A visible camera gives people certainty. They know where it is. They know what it points at. They know what it records. But when people know a security system exists and can't identify it, their minds start filling in blanks. And those blanks are almost always worse than reality. Over the next couple weeks, I started noticing odd behavior. Cynthia drove past my property twice in one day. Slowly. The second time, she nearly stopped. 3 days later, one of the HOA board members parked across the road and sat there for 15 minutes pretending to check his phone. Another board member suddenly became interested in talking with neighbors near my eastern fence line. Nobody directly asked questions. Nobody made accusations. Yet the curiosity was impossible to miss. One afternoon, I was repairing a gate when my neighbor Frank wandered over. Frank was retired Army. The man noticed everything. He leaned against the fence and grinned. "You got them nervous." I laughed. "What are you talking about?" "The HOA." I don't think about them anymore. Well, they're definitely thinking about you. What makes you say that? Frank nodded toward Pine Hollow. Cynthia asked me if I'd seen any unusual equipment on your property. I nearly dropped the wrench in my hand. Seriously. Twice. What'd you tell her? Frank's grin widened. Told her I didn't know what she was talking about. I shook my head. Unbelievable. People fear what they can't understand. The funny thing was, he wasn't wrong. The more invisible the system remained, the more attention it seemed to attract. One evening, Lucas called to check in. After listening to my updates, he started laughing again. Let me guess, he said. They're getting nervous. How can you tell? Because uncertainty scares people. What do you mean? A camera provides information. And information creates certainty. I thought about that. He continued. When people know they're being recorded, they know the rules. They understand the situation. And when they don't, they invent stories. That conversation stuck with me, because the more I observed Cynthia and the HOA board, the more I realized this had never really been about privacy. If privacy had been the concern, somebody would have knocked on my door before destroying property. If privacy had been the concern, they would have asked questions, started the conversation, tried cooperation. Instead, they chose control. That's what this was really about. The cameras represented something they couldn't influence, something existing beyond HOA authority. And now the replacement system represented something even worse, something they couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't control. Then one Saturday morning, about a month after the cameras were destroyed, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't expected to see, Cynthia Wells. For a moment I considered ignoring it. After our last conversation, I figured she'd already said everything she wanted to say, but curiosity got the better of me. So I answered. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she cleared her throat. Ethan. Immediately I noticed something different. The confidence was gone. The rehearsed corporate tone was gone. For the first time since I'd known her, she sounded uncertain. I was hoping we could meet in person. I leaned back in my chair. About what? A pause. Then carefully, almost cautiously, she said, I believe there may have been some misunderstandings regarding recent events. I couldn't help laughing. Misunderstandings. That was an interesting word for what had happened. What I didn't know yet was that before the day ended, Cynthia and the entire HOA board would be sitting on my front porch, looking very different from the people who had destroyed my cameras. And the reason for that change had nothing to do with lawsuits, police reports, or legal threats. It had everything to do with fear and the realization that they no longer knew where the limits of their power ended. That afternoon answered a question I'd been asking myself for weeks. What had finally changed? A few hours after the phone call, a black SUV pulled into my driveway, then another one behind it. I stepped onto the porch just as Cynthia Wells climbed out of the passenger seat. The difference between the woman standing in front of me and the woman who had hung up on me a month earlier was impossible to miss. Back then, she'd carried herself like someone delivering orders. Now she looked like someone hoping not to receive any. 2 HOA board members followed her up the walkway. Neither looked particularly comfortable. One kept adjusting his tie. The other avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody carried rule books. Nobody carried violation notices. Nobody arrived with threats. Instead, Cynthia carried a thick folder pressed tightly against her chest. We sat around the small table on my porch while a warm Colorado breeze moved through the trees. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Cynthia opened the folder. We'd like to resolve this matter. I leaned back. I'm listening. She slid several documents across the table. Equipment replacement estimates, reimbursement agreements, installation coverage, property damage compensation. I slowly flipped through the pages. Every destroyed camera, every mounting bracket, every damaged cable, every installation cost. Everything was covered. Not only that, they were offering upgraded equipment, higher-end cameras, better recording systems, professional installation. The total amount was significantly higher than what they'd originally destroyed. For several seconds, I simply stared at the paperwork, not because I was shocked, because the contrast was almost funny. A month earlier, they acted like they owned the world. Now they were negotiating. I looked up. What changed? The question landed harder than I expected. Cynthia glanced toward the other board members. Neither volunteered an answer. I waited. Finally, she forced a smile. We'd like to improve our relationship with neighboring property owners. I laughed, not loudly, just enough. That's not what changed. Her expression tightened. Ethan. No, seriously, I'm curious. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched. One board member shifted uncomfortably. The other looked toward the driveway, and suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. They weren't worried about the cameras anymore. They were worried about uncertainty. Rumors had spread, stories had spread, speculation had spread. Every failed attempt to figure out my new security setup had created something much bigger than surveillance. It had created mystery. A mystery tends to make control-oriented people extremely uncomfortable, especially when they can't solve it. Finally, Cynthia sighed. Residents have expressed concerns. There it was. The real reason. I folded my arms. Concerns about what? The new system. What about it? People don't understand how it works. I couldn't help smiling. Interesting. Nobody responded. I continued, because nobody seemed interested in understanding the old system before they destroyed it. Silence, again. Not one person had an answer. For the first time since this whole thing began, they were being forced to sit inside the same uncertainty they had created for someone else, and they hated it. Eventually, Cynthia pushed the paperwork closer. We would like to formally acknowledge your right to maintain security equipment on your property. There was something strangely satisfying about hearing those words, not because I needed their permission, I never did, but because they were finally acknowledging reality. For years, they'd operated as if authority automatically belonged to them, as if proximity created ownership, as if rules applied wherever they wanted them to apply. Now they were being forced to recognize limits. I reviewed everything carefully. No tricks, no hidden clauses, no language restricting future installations, just reimbursement. Full reimbursement. Finally, I signed. The effect was immediate. The tension drained from the table. One board member visibly relaxed. Another released a breath he had apparently been holding for half an hour. Even Cynthia seemed relieved, as though a storm had just passed. Before leaving, she stood and extended her hand. For a second, I considered refusing. Then I shook it. I hope we can move forward, she said. So do I. And surprisingly, I meant it, because despite everything that had happened, I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't interested in endless legal battles. I wasn't interested in becoming the neighborhood villain. I just wanted people to respect boundaries. That was all. A few weeks later, the replacement system was installed. Ironically, thanks to HOA money, I ended up with cameras far better than the ones they destroyed. Higher resolution, better night vision, improved storage, the works. Neighbors could see them clearly, and that seemed to make everyone feel better. The warning notices stopped. The surprise inspections stopped. The passive-aggressive letters stopped. Life gradually returned to normal, at least on the surface. Because here's the part nobody in Pine Hollow ever learned. The cameras were no longer my primary security system, not even close. The sensor network Lucas helped build never went away. It remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden beneath fence rails, inside landscaping features, along access routes, near storage areas, quietly monitoring activity 24 hours a day. It never recorded faces, never captured conversations, never invaded anyone's privacy, yet it provided something far more valuable than video ever could: awareness. And over time, I began noticing something fascinating. The system itself wasn't what changed people's behavior. The idea of the system changed their behavior. People stopped taking shortcuts across my land. Contractors started respecting property lines. Maintenance crews stayed where they belonged. Nobody had actually seen the sensors, but they believed they might be there. And sometimes belief is more powerful than reality. Years have passed since all this happened. Most of the original HOA board has moved away. New families live in Pine Hollow now. The neighborhood is quieter, friendlier, less obsessed with control. Every once in a while, though, I still notice something amusing. A board member driving a little slower past my property, someone standing near the fence looking around, a curious neighbor trying to figure out what exactly is hidden out there. They never find anything, at least not anything obvious. And every time it happens, I remember something Lucas told me during one of our late-night conversations. What people fear most isn't being watched. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I do. What people fear most is not knowing what exists, not knowing what someone knows, not knowing what someone knows, not knowing where the limits are. Uncertainty fills empty spaces with imagination, and imagination is usually far scarier than reality. The funny thing is, Cynthia probably believed this battle was about cameras, but it never was. The cameras were just the symptom. The real conflict was about boundaries, respect, power. And what happens when people become so convinced of their authority that they stop recognizing where it ends? The moment they stepped onto property they didn't own and destroyed something that didn't belong to them, they created a problem they couldn't control. And in trying to eliminate a system they could see, they accidentally created one they couldn't. Maybe they genuinely thought they were protecting the neighborhood. Maybe they honestly believed they were acting in everyone's best interest. Or maybe they simply couldn't tolerate the existence of something outside their influence. To this day, I'm not completely sure, and that's where I'd like to hear your opinion. If you came home and discovered someone had entered your property and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of equipment because they thought they knew better, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the reimbursement like I did? Or would you have taken them to court anyway and pushed for consequences? And here's the bigger question. Do you think the HOA was truly trying to protect the community? Or was this really about control from the very beginning? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I can honestly see arguments on both sides, and stories like this always bring out strong opinions. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories about neighborhood conflicts, property rights, and those moments when ordinary people discover that power isn't always where everyone thinks it is. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't about cameras, fences, or security systems at all. Sometimes they're about what happens when someone finally learns that authority has limits, and that not everyone is willing to pretend otherwise.